This week, we are going to be talking about creating a character select system using scriptable objects. So this is a continuation of our previous session on creating an ability system with scriptable objects. I'll give a little demo of the whole system working, what we're going to build before we move into the step-by-step instruction. And so let's switch over to Unity. So you should be seeing Unity right now. And so I'm just going to give a quick demonstration of what this will look like when it's complete. And then we'll move over to an incomplete version of the project and start implementing some of this functionality. So here, if I play the scene, we have our character select menu. So here we can select from Little Joe or Big Danny, our two characters. And if we click Little Joe, it will spawn our player prefab into the scene. We see we have this ability cooldown bar at the bottom of the screen. And so we can fire a laser or we can shoot grenades. And so these are both abilities which this character has and which are set in a character scriptable object, which I'll show you in a second. If we select the other character, Big Danny, we'll see we have this green laser, which has slightly different physics properties. It adds less force. And then we also have this rocket projectile as opposed to the grenade, and the rocket explodes on impact. Now, if you're interested in more information about how the different types of shooting are done, we actually have a new series called the Let's Try tutorial series, which is the first one is out now about shooting with raycasts, and the raycasting weapon is covered there, and the projectile weapon is coming soon. That's the next one in the series. So I'm using that content here to demonstrate what we're doing. So just a real brief look at the finished scene. We have here a UI canvas, which has our ability panel, which is what's displaying. I'll just pause with the abilities up just so we can refer to them. So we have our canvas, which is displaying the two icons and also showing the cooldowns when we fire. And each of these has an ability cooldown script attached to them. And this is the main script that we wrote last time. And we'll take a really short look at it in the course of this training. And then we have the character select panel, which I'll just turn on briefly, which is the oh, we can't see it because it's in the UI, which is the menu that we're going to make today where we select our characters from. And so controlling that, we have this character selector script, which is the script that we're going to write today. And so what this allows us to do is to create an array of characters, which are scriptable objects, and select which character we want to use by clicking one of the menu buttons, and it will then take from within that character, I'll just show one of the characters, the different abilities that we've added to that character. So both of these characters are scriptable objects. So if you missed the last session and you don't know what a scriptable object is a script is a script which is not a component and not attached to a game object in the scene. So a very common use for scriptable objects is as pure data holders, right? So in this case, if we just wanted to create a character profile that contained the name and the starting hit points as we have here, we could do that. But in our previous example, we showed how we can also use scriptable objects to execute some functions. And so those are done in these ability scriptable objects, which you can learn more about by watching our previous training, and we'll look at very briefly in the course of this training. But basically, we have these four different abilities, our two projectile abilities and our two raycast abilities, and each of these characters uses two of those abilities. So we have an array of abilities, ability scriptable objects in a character scriptable object. And we'll write the character scriptable object class today along with the character selector. And if you want more info about the ability class, the raycast ability, or the general ability system, please check out the last training. Okay, so now, I'm going to close. This is my complete version of the project. I'm going to close this and jump over to, this is another instance of the Unity editor, which is running my incomplete version of the project, which is where we left off last time. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add the UI components that we need to our canvas. And so let's actually name this UI canvas just to be a little more clear. And so currently we just have these two ability icon game objects, which have the ability cooldowns on them, and which, if we play the scene, they will pull the sprite from the scriptable object and display the cooldown when we fire the abilities. So what we're going to add are the UI objects that we need for our character select menu. Now, this is going to be super simple since it's not the main focus. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a UI panel. So that's under Game Object UI Panel. And so this is going to hold the various buttons in the menu, and we're also going to use this to turn on and off the different aspects of the menu. So we are going to create a new panel. By default, it starts filling the whole canvas. And what we'll do is we'll just grab the anchors here, which is always a little bit tricky. There we go. And I'm just going to really roughly make a box in the middle of the screen that's generally centered there. And using the anchors, this will make sure that this UI element is resolution independent, right? And then we're going to zero out the pixel offsets in the left, top, right, and bottom. And let's also make this 100% opaque. Under color, the color for the image, the default is this kind of 50% opaque white. We're going to just turn the alpha all the way up to 255 so it's fully white. Let's label this. This is going to be our character panel. And now we will create a second one, which is going to hold the ability icons so we can turn those off as a group. So again, Game Object, UI, Panel. This will be ability panel, and I'm just going to turn off the image component here. I'm really just using this as a holder object, and then I'm going to make both ability icons children of this panel so that when we disable it, they will disappear. Okay, so for the character panel, we're going to add a UI text, which is going to be a child of the character panel, and will read in the text component. We're going to set the default text to select your character, and then we're going to anchor it using the anchor preset in the rect transform to the middle top. So we're going to hold down the Alt or Option key and click there to set it at the top, and then we'll just give it a little bit of pixel offset to move it down, and then center and middle align the text. And then we'll create our first, and let's label this, call this select prompt, and then let's create our first button. So we're going to go back to Game Object, UI, button. And again, this button is going to be a child of the character panel, and we'll call this is going to end up being Little Joe, so we'll just label that. And we'll write the text in here as well, just while we're at it. Little Joe text. Or actually, it should just be Little Joe here. Like so. And so this is going to, we will use the anchor preset in the rect transform, and again, alt click on the center this time just to center it on the panel, and then we'll move it up a little bit when we create the second one. All right, so now we have the kind of basic UI elements that we're going to need. Now we need a script to give them some functionality. So what we're going to do, we're going to create a character selector script that when we click one of these buttons is going to call the only function in that script, and choose one of the characters from our scriptable object array and spawn the player prefab into the world. Now, we have two scripts that we're going to write. We're going to write the character selector script, and we're also going to write the character scriptable object class. So let's highlight our scripts folder, and let's first create the character class, because that's actually pretty simple. So with the scripts folder highlighted, we're going to choose create C# script, and we'll call this character. And let's double click it to open it in Monodevelop. So the first thing that we're going to do is we are going to set character to derive from scriptable object instead of Monobehaviour, right? This class is not going to be a component. It's not going to be attached to anything in the scene. It's going to sit in our assets folder, or we're going to create asset instances from it. So we can delete the start and update functions because scriptable object actually does not receive these callbacks. It only receives 3 callbacks, which are on enable, on disable, and on destroy. So generally speaking, when you're working with scriptable objects, you're going to want to have a Monobehaviour which lives in the scene and which is going to hook up to your gameplay and call functions on the scriptable object if the scriptable object is going to have any functions in it, or you can use it as a data container, which is actually how we're going to use it today. So we're going to declare a few public variables. So we're going to have a public string called character name, and that'll be equal to default, just so we know we haven't put anything in there. And we're going to have a public integer called starting HP, which will be equal to 100. Now, we're not actually using either of these in the demo today. I'm just kind of providing them as an example of the types of things you might put in a character. The thing that we are going to use is a public array of abilities. And these are going to be called character abilities. And these are going to be those ability scriptable objects I showed you earlier, like the raycast ability or the projectile ability. We're going to put those into this array to say what abilities this character has. Now, the last thing that we're going to do is we are going to add the create asset menu attribute and pass it menu name, and that's going to equal character. And so what this means is now in the asset menu, we're going to have a menu option to create a new asset of the type character, right? So this is something that's added, I think, in Unity 5.2, whereas in the past, to create scriptable objects, you would have needed to do a little bit of editor scripting. Now that's been pleasantly simplified. So let's save that. Jump back over to Unity. And now, if we highlight our scriptable object folder and go to assets, we can go choose create character. So we now have this new option in our menu here to create a character. And when we do, it will create a new character, and we'll call this Lil Joe and specify his name. His default hit points of 100 are fine, and then we will give him 2 abilities. So we will give him the pink laser ability, which is a scriptable object that we made in the last training session, and the, what do we have? He had the grenade. Let's give him the grenade. So now he's got those abilities, and let's create our second character as well. We can either just create a new character, or we can just duplicate Little Joe, which is what I'm going to do, and we'll make Big Danny. And Big Danny is going to have more hit points because he's big, and he will have the green laser ability and the missile projectile ability. So now that we have our characters, we can create our character selector script. So I am going to create this attached to the UI canvas because it's going to be turning on and off these child objects of the canvas. I feel like that's a logical place to have it. So we are going to make a new script called character selector, and I'm doing that just by typing the name. And then since it doesn't exist, it gives us the option to make a new script. And I'm going to say create and add. I like this because it creates it attached to the game object already, and I don't forget to drag it on. But then you do have to grab it and move it to your scripts folder from there. It just creates it in the root of the assets folder. All right, so let's open that up. And just get my notes here. Okay, so I'm going to write this script a little bit differently. In the past, I kind of write them from top to bottom, write all the variables, and then just kind of work my way down. I'm going to try to do it kind of in a more functional order here. So what we're going to do first is there's only going to be one function in this class, which is going to be a public function that returns void called start game. Start game is going to take an integer parameter called character choice. So this is going to be the function that is going to be called when we click our button. And the parameter is going to be passed in from the button. So when in the onClick event that's going to call the function, we can actually specify an integer, which is in this case going to be the number of the character or the index in the characters array that we want to set as our selected character. And so we're going to pass that in that way. And I'll show you how to set that up in a minute. So the first thing that we want this to do is to spawn our player prefab. Now, this is going to be really maybe different in your game. You may already have the player in the scene. In this case, I'm going to spawn him in and position him via script. This is not so specific to this topic, but it's just the way I decided to implement it. So your mileage may vary. But so we're going to declare a public variable, game object variable called player. And we're also going to declare a spawn position. So a public vector3 player spawn position. And that's going to be equal to a new vector3, which is 0, 1, -7, which is really just the current position of the player in the scene. I wanted to do this without a reference to scene objects or to like a transform object in the scene in case we wanted to change scenes or just to have this be kind of separate, but obviously you could do this a different way if you wanted to. And so then what we're going to do is we are going to declare a game object variable called spawned player. And that's going to be equal to instantiate player at player spawn position with a rotation of quaternion.identity, meaning the original rotation of the prefab. So that's just, oh, and we need to cast it to a game object. We want to return, so instantiate returns an object, and we just want to specify, we want to cast this to a game object and store it in our spawned player variable so we can do more things with it in a moment. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is we want to find a reference to whatever object we're going to use as the weapon for the player. So let's actually look for a moment at the player prefab. So back in Unity, here is our FPS controller, which is our player prefab. And if we expand its hierarchy, we find this gun game object. And the gun has two scripts attached to it, raycast shoot triggerable and projectile shoot triggerable. And so these are the components which are going to do the actual raycast using data from the scriptable objects and actually launch the projectile. So these are monobehaviors. Now, what we want to be able to do is to find what object. We don't want to hard code references to raycast shoot triggerable or projectile shoot triggerable, because that would defeat some of the flexibility that we've created by using them as scriptable objects or by kind of controlling them using scriptable objects. So we just want to get the game object that any weapon functionality components would be attached to. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a component called weapon marker. And this is actually going to be an empty monobehavior, which we're going to use to find this object using get component in children. And so we're going to do that next. So here, once we've spawned the player, we're going to declare a variable of the type weapon marker called weapon marker. And we are going to set that to equal spawned player dot get component in children weapon marker. So what this is going to do is search starting from the spawned player object, which in this case is the parent FPS controller, and it's going to work its way down the hierarchy until it finds a weapon marker component attached to a game object. And we're going to use that to locate where the weapon scripts are in the hierarchy. Okay. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to find however many ability icons, or as I've called them here, cooldown buttons, are attached, are children of this canvas. So in this case, we have 2, right? We're going to find those and we're going to store them in an array. So we are going to declare an array of the type ability cooldown, which we'll look at in a moment, called cooldown buttons. And that is going to be equal to get components, plural, in children, get components in children, ability cooldown. So what this will do is it will look through the children attached to the game object that this is attached to, so the canvas in this case, and it will search down the hierarchy and store any ability cooldown scripts it finds in our array cooldown buttons, right? So get component in children we can use to find 1, get components in children we can use to find multiple. And so we're going to store those in an array, and then the next thing that we need to do is to say when the player clicked the button, which character did they select? So they're going to be selecting a character from an array of characters. So character. So we're going to have a public array of characters called predictably characters. And those are going to be set in the inspector. In this case, it's our 2 character scriptable objects that we created. And so what we're going to do is we're going to declare a character variable called selected character. This is going to be the one that we've chosen or that our player has chosen, and that's going to be equal to characters character choice. So the index in the array specified in this integer parameter, right? So somebody clicks start game and the button has a 0 set in it, then we're going to get index 0 in the characters array, which in this case would be our little Joe character. And the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to loop through all of the cooldown buttons in our cooldown buttons array and initialize them. And this is probably a good moment to take a look for like a super quick look at the ability cooldown script that we wrote last time. But first, let me just take a look at the chat and see if there are any questions I can help with. Okay, so somebody's asking, can I differ between character abilities and character characteristics, as in I wouldn't put a character size in the ability dropdown? Well, in this case, right, we didn't have a variable for size, but we had a variable for hit points, and that was actually put in the character scriptable object, whereas the specific details, if we just jump back over to Unity for a second, we put in our, let's say, our little Joe character scriptable object, we have the name and the hit points. Then in the pink laser scriptable object, we have the base cooldown, the damage, the range, hit force, laser color, etc. So, and obviously this is just based on the fact that I have these kind of shooting scripts that I wanted to use for my content. But if you're doing a turn-based strategy game or a role-playing game or whatever, you're going to have different parameters and, may need to implement things a little bit differently. Someone is asking, will this be available on YouTube later? Yes, it will, later this week. The question is, are scriptable objects good for providing a security measure for hacking? I would not say that that is strictly relevant here. So I would say no. All right. It's worth noting here that you cannot... Scriptable objects are not useful for storing data generated at runtime. So if you could not store your save state in a scriptable object. I would use, if you are concerned about your save data being human readable, like it would be in XML or in player prefs, then I would use the binary formatter to write your save state. Let's take a look at the ability cooldown script. So we're going from character selector, we are going to get a reference to all of the ability cooldown scripts attached to the canvas and initialize them, right? And so let's take a look at what is happening when we do that. So if we open the ability cooldown script, we will see that we have a public string for what fire button is going to trigger it, a public reference to the mask, the text display. And then here, this is something that we're actually going to change, because in a previous session, I needed to be able to set via the inspector what ability was assigned to the current, to each instance of ability cooldown, right? And I did that by dragging and dropping in the inspector. But actually, in the final system, that's going to be set in this function here from character selector. So the way that I did a temporary workaround on that was that I serialized both of these fields. And what that means is that they remain private. They're inaccessible from other scripts, but they appear in the inspector. So you can edit them by hand, but you cannot have something else come in and set their value. And so in this case, the way that I'm setting the value is in this function, right? You couldn't actually access these directly from outside of the script or outside of the class. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to remove these now, because we're about to write in character selector the code that is going to set these up for us via script, as opposed to setting them in the inspector. And I'm also going to comment out this line where we were calling initialize from start. And that was another temporary measure that we took in order to be able to show the system working without writing the character selector last time. So now what we have is we have this public function that returns void called initialize, which takes a parameter of the type ability called selected ability and a game object parameter called weapon holder. And so what we're doing in here is we're setting the ability private variable here to equal whatever we passed in using selected ability. So now the ability that this is going to be managing the cooldown for is going to be whatever was passed in from when we called the initialize function from character selector. And then we're going to go through and get our component references and set up the rest of the stuff that we need for this class, which you can learn about in the last training. But basically what's happening here is that this is going to initialize the ability, and then the ability is going to initialize the raycast shoot triggerable or the projectile shoot triggerable or whatever monobehavior it's using in the system. So we have a kind of a chain of initializations that starts with the character selector. Character selector initializes the ability cooldown. Ability cooldown initializes the ability and the actual monobehavior that does the shooting. Okay, so back in character selector, we're going to write the code that's going to call this function on each of these components. So we are going to do this using a for loop. So we're going to just make sure I've got, yep. We're going to create a new for loop that starts at 0, and it's going to loop through from 0 to cooldown buttons.length, right? So however many buttons are found at this stage, right? We're going to get a component reference to all of them. However many there are, that is going to become cooldown buttons.length. So in this case, it's going to be 0 and 1, right? And then we are going to loop through the array until we've initialized all of them. So here, what we're going to do is we're going to say cooldown buttons I. So for this cooldown button, we're going to call the initialize function, which I was just showing you. And then we're going to pass in selected character dot character abilities. So remember, our character has an array of character abilities. In this case, they each have 2 abilities in that array currently. So we are going to pass in the selected character abilities I ability, right? So one thing that's worth noting here, I did not do anything to take care of situations where there is an uneven, there are, for example, more abilities than there are buttons or more buttons than there are abilities. What will happen if you have too many abilities? They'll just get ignored because we're going to run out of buttons. If you have more abilities than you have buttons, it'll just load as many as it can into the buttons. And if you have too few abilities and too many buttons, it will just leave you with blank buttons, which you should see very clearly because their icons won't change and stuff. So obviously in your own system, you can, account for that, but I just wanted to keep this a little bit compact. But that is something that you might run into. And then we are going to, for the second parameter of initialize, we're going to pass in weapon marker dot game object. So we're calling initialize. The selected ability is going to be this ability in the character's array of abilities, and weapon holder is going to be whatever object we found that had a weapon marker, or the first, I should say, you don't want to have multiple copies of this, the first object that we found that had a weapon marker attached to it. You could do this with tag and so on. I just moved away from using tags. And then the last thing that we need to do here, which is nice and simple, is we're just going to turn off the character select panel. Once we've selected a character, we don't need it anymore. So we're going to declare a public variable of the type game object called character select panel. And then we are going to have a public game object called ability panel, which is going to hold a reference. These are each going to be set in the inspector and hold references to the character select panel we created and the ability panel. And we're going to use these to turn on and off those panels when somebody selected a character. So first of all, we're going to say character select panel dot set active false, and then ability panel dot set active true. So we're going to hide or deactivate the character select panel and set active or activate the ability panel. And that's it for that script. So not a super complicated script. It's touching on a few different things, but really not that complicated when you get down to it. And so let's just do our last steps here in the editor. Before I do those, let me take a look and see if anybody has any questions about the script. Actually, I'll leave it on screen while I do that, just if anybody wants to look. Afix asks, do serialized variable values save during play, or do you have to copy values and paste them when the game isn't running? No, the serialized variables are just like regular public variables in the inspector. They're going to be reset when entering and exiting play if you make changes during play mode. One thing that's nice about scriptable objects is because they're an asset, they do not reset. So if we changed our character's hit points value while we were playing, that would not be reset. And that's actually something that I have used in other projects to work around the issue of stuff not persisting in play mode. Let's say you have a whole lot of enemies that you want to edit, and you want the game to be playing so you can tweak the values, and then you want those values to be saved and you can't copy every component. You can have a scriptable object that backs up the Monobehaviour that's actually running in the game and sets its values, and then you can tweak the values in the scriptable object, and that will persist when entering and exiting play mode. That's actually a really nice use for them, just as like a pure data container. Gideon303 asks, why not a for each? Because we generally discourage the use of for each, I think because they allocate. I can't remember the specific problem with them, but because they allocate memory for the garbage collector. I think that's I've just been told that you should avoid using them, and we kind of recommend to people not to use them. I believe that's why, but I have to double check that. But generally speaking, I think when we upgrade our mono version and our garbage collector and a bunch of other stuff, which is coming sometime in the not too distant future, they will be sort of allowed again, but for now they are frowned upon. Yes, there we go. Yes, as Yazerkula says, no for each to avoid garbage collection. It is as I thought. And the question is, do scriptable objects persist per scene? Yes, that's what's great about them. They're assets. They live in the project folder. So if you it's like a material, right? If you change the color of a material while playing, it will not revert to the previous color because you're editing the asset, not like an instance of the asset or something in the scene. It's actually an asset in the project folder. So scriptable objects, because they're assets, you could tweak their values and they will not be reset when you exit play mode. Yeah. All right. I see Mike Geig, the heroic Mike Geig, is in the chat. Good to see you, Mike. Thank you for stopping by. Many people have commented on YouTube and various other places that they miss Mike and confused me for Mike. This is actually Matt Schell, not Mike Geig, but Mike Geig is with us today in the chat. So hooray! And good to see you there. So let's now just set up what we need to set up in Unity. So we need to drag our references to our various public variables here. So we're going to drag a reference to our character panel so we can turn that on and off, or turn it off really. Our ability panel so we can turn it on, and let's turn it off to start with. And then we will drag a reference to the FPS controller prefab, which is our player prefab. And I need to, because I added the weapon marker component to it, I need to apply the changes to the prefab, and I am going to delete it from my scene. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a camera that is just looking at the canvas. So this is going to be so we're not actually changing scenes when we go from this menu to our 3D scene. We're just going from one camera to the other, which happens when we instantiate the FPS controller, because that has the first-person camera attached to it. Okay, so we have our one button for our one character. So now we just need to make our second button. And so what I'm going to do is, before I duplicate this button, I'm going to set the on-click event here. So let's So anytime you want to have a button do something in a script, you're going to need to add an on-click event. So I'm going to add an empty one by clicking the plus button, and then I'm going to drag my UI canvas because that holds the script whose function we want to call. And then we're going to select character select start game. We really should call this something else. But okay, start game is fine. I mean, it does start the game. It should be like on character select. It's fine. And notice that because I'm just going to change it. Let's call it on character select just to make it, I think, better. Because this has an integer parameter, save. It's going to finish compiling. Because it has an integer parameter, bloop, where did it go? Oh, there it is. We can specify that. Now, in this case, we actually want to use the default value of 0 because we are going to be selecting the 0th element in our array, which we actually need to add. So let's drag in our 2 character scriptable objects. So we'll drag in Little Joe and Big Danny. So now when we pass in that 0, that's going to give us element 0 here. And then the next button, we are going to pass in a 1, which is going to give us element 1 here. So let's just test to make sure that works before we copy it. So here we have our character, click the button, boop, there he is. It's complaining that there are 2 audio listeners. I'll fix that right quick. We will just take off the audio listener from our menu camera, and let's label that menu camera. And so now we can duplicate this button. We'll call it Big Danny. And I'm just going to position this one with a pixel offset below the other one. You could use like a vertical layout group maybe if you wanted to be slick about it. But in this case, I'm just going to move it down. And we're going to change its text, right? So that it reflects the correct text in the game view. And we are going to change the integer here to be a 1. So that now we will be spawning element 1 or selecting this scriptable object with those properties. And so play, select Big Danny. And it's throwing me an error, which is interesting. Ability icon. Weapon holder is not assigned. Oh, is this... Oh, did I not save my changes to ability cooldown? Save, I say. That may be it. Let's see. Because I can see they should not still be public in the inspector. There we go. No more problems. Okay, good. So now when we click 1, we load 1 character. And when we click the other, we load the other. And so that is our show for today. I will stick around and take some more questions, but hopefully you found this interesting. Now, obviously, for your games, you're going to need to make some changes and some adaptations, but I hope that this suggests some ideas for you about ways which you can use scriptable objects, both in this case to hold data, as we showed today, or in the last session to execute functions as well. So yeah, let's take some questions. And for those of you who are on your way out, thanks so much for watching.